My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 32 years old, living in a small town in Idaho. I work as a traveling salesman, which means I spend a lot of time on the road driving from place to place. Usually it's peaceful, just me, the radio, and the long stretches of highway. But one night, something happened that I'll never forget. It was late, it's around 11 p.m., and I was driving along a desolate highway, trying to make it to the next town before crashing at a motel for the night. The road was pitch black, no streetlights, no other cars in sight, just the hum of my engine and the occasional flicker of my headlights reflecting off the road signs. As I was driving, something caught my eye up ahead, a figure standing on the side of the road. At first, I thought it might be an animal, but as I got closer, I realized it was a woman. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair and pale skin, wearing a thin jacket. She looked cold, shivering in the chilly night air, with her thumb out trying to hitch a ride. I'm not the type to pick up hitchhikers, especially not this late at night, but something about her seemed desperate. She looked like she really needed help, so against my better judgment, I slowed down and pulled over beside her. She didn't say anything at first, just opened the passenger door and got in. I glanced over her as she buckled her seatbelt. Her face was pale and she was shaking slightly, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You all right?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She nodded, barely looking at me. "Can you take me to the next town? It's about an hour away," she muttered, her voice barely a whisper. "Sure," I said, feeling a little uneasy, but not wanting to leave her out there, in the middle of nowhere. I started driving again, the silence in the car heavy and awkward. For the first few minutes, she didn't say a word. I tried to make small talk, asking her where she was heading, but she just gave short, vague answers. Her eyes were fixed on the road ahead, staring straight ahead like she was in some kind of trance. She didn't blink, not once. It was unsettling. After a while, I gave up trying to talk and just focused on the road, but the air in the car felt thick, like something was wrong. I kept glancing over at her, but she just sat there, rigid, staring ahead. Then something weird happened. As we drove further into the darkness, I felt a cold breeze sweep through the car, even though the windows were closed. I thought maybe it was my imagination, but then I felt it again. This time, a light brush against my arm, like someone's fingers grazing my skin. I jumped, my heart pounding, and glanced over at her. She hadn't moved. She was still sitting there, staring straight ahead, her hands in her lap. But I swear, I felt something. It was like someone had reached out and touched me. I shook it off, telling myself I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the feeling didn't go away. The car felt colder, and every few minutes I'd feel that same light touch, as if someone or something was trying to get my attention. We were nearing the town now, and I couldn't wait to drop her off and get out of there. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, like I had made a mistake by picking her up. Finally, we reached the outskirts of the town. The streetlights flickered on, casting a soft glow over the empty roads. I slowed down, relieved to be almost there. "This is the place, right?" I asked, my voice shaky. There was no answer. I turned to look at her, but the passenger seat was empty. I slammed on the brakes, my heart racing. I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of her. She was just gone. I hadn't heard the door open, hadn't felt the car stop, nothing. 1 second she was there, and the next she had vanished. I sat there for a minute, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My hands were shaking, and my mind was racing. I looked back at the road behind me, but it was empty. No sign of her anywhere. I drove into town, still trying to process it all, and decided to stop at a diner. I needed to calm down, maybe figure out what was going on. I told the waitress what had happened, half expecting her to think I was crazy, but instead, she just gave me a strange look and said, "You're not the first one. That stretch of highway. A girl went missing there years ago. They never found her. People say they still see her, hitchhiking, looking for a ride, but she always disappears before they reach the town." I left the diner, my mind spinning. I didn't know what to believe, but one thing was for sure. I'll never pick up another hitchhiker again. Not after that night. Not after her. My name is Laura Davis, and I'm 30 years old. A few months ago, I was driving across the country, taking some time off work to clear my head. I'd always liked road trips, the freedom of being alone, just me and the open road. It was peaceful, or at least it used to be. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and I was somewhere in the middle of nowhere, driving down a long, empty stretch of rural highway, the kind of road where you don't see another car for miles. I was heading west, trying to make it to the next town before sunset, when I spotted him. A man was standing by at the side of the road, his thumb out, looking for a ride. Normally, I wouldn't stop for hitchhikers. I'd heard too many horror stories, but there was something about him. He looked harmless, I guess. Mid-40s, scruffy, wearing an old brown jacket. His face was hard to read, but he didn't seem threatening. Plus, it was getting dark, and I figured he needed help. So I pulled over. He climbed into the passenger seat without a word, just gave me a brief nod. I tried to make small talk as we started driving, asking him where he was headed, but he barely responded, just another nod or a grunt. Maybe he wasn't much of a talker, I thought. No, fine by me. I didn't need to chat the whole time. For the first half hour, everything seemed fine. But then I started to notice something strange. Every few minutes, he would pull out a small notebook and start scribbling in it. He did it quietly, not making a sound, but I could see him out of the corner of my eye. Scribble, scribble, scribble. At first, I thought maybe he was writing down directions or something, so I didn't think much of it. But after a while, I couldn't help but feel a little uneasy. He never showed me what he was writing, and he never explained it. He just kept staring straight ahead, occasionally glancing down at the notebook. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the road, but the silence was heavy. Every time I glanced at him, he was still scribbling. At one point, I asked him if he needed anything, water, food, anything to break the tension, but he didn't respond. He just kept writing. After about an hour of driving, I needed to stop for gas. We pulled into a small, run-down gas station in the middle of nowhere. I got out of the car to stretch my legs, but the man stayed inside, hunched over his notebook, scribbling furiously. Something about it didn't sit right with me. I had this nagging feeling that I needed to see what he was writing. So, while he was distracted, I walked around to his side of the car, pretending to check something near the passenger door. I leaned in, just enough to catch a glimpse of the notebook. What I saw made my stomach drop. There were sketches of me, page after page, all of them detailed drawings of my face, my hands on the steering wheel, even the way my hair looked from the side. And then, in between the sketches, there were notes, descriptions of everything I had done since he got into the car, how I had smiled when I picked him up, how I had adjusted the rearview mirror, how my fingers tapped nervously on the steering wheel. Every move I made, he had written down. I felt a cold sweat break out across my skin. My hands were shaking as I stepped back from the car, trying to keep calm. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, but I couldn't let him see that I had looked. I took a deep breath and forced myself to act normal, walking back to the driver's seat. When I got in, I asked him as casually as I could, "What are you writing in there?" For the first time since he'd gotten into the car, he turned and looked directly at me. And then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, almost like he knew something I didn't. Without saying a word, he opened the door, stepped out of the car, and walked away into the darkness. I sat there, frozen, watching him disappear into the night. I didn't wait. I started the car and drove as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the next town. Weeks later, I was at home scrolling through the news when a headline caught my eye. Serial killer still at large, known for sketching victims before striking. My blood ran cold as I clicked on the article. There, on the screen, was a sketch of a woman. She looked exactly like me. I never found out who he was, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never pick up a hitchhiker again. My name's Nick. I'm 27 and I love road trips. There's something about driving through long stretches of road that clears my mind. A few months ago, I was taking a solo trip through the desert. No real destination in mind, just enjoying the peace. But what happened on that trip changed the way I see the road forever. It was late afternoon and I was on a remote desert highway. Nothing but miles of sand and dust around me. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky with deep oranges and reds. That's when I saw him, a guy standing next to a beat-up old car on the side of the road, waving me down. I don't usually pick up hitchhikers, but he looked desperate, stranded in the middle of nowhere. His car looked dead, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to help, so I pulled over and rolled down the window. He introduced himself as Greg, said his car had broken down, and asked if I could give him a lift to the nearest town. He looked rough, scruffy beard, worn out clothes, but I felt bad for him. I told him to hop in. He grabbed a large, heavy duffel bag from his trunk and threw it into the back seat before sliding into the passenger seat. At first, everything seemed fine. Greg was quiet, just staring out the window, but after a few minutes, I noticed he was acting weird. He kept fidgeting with the duffel bag, adjusting it, pulling it closer to him. His fingers were twitching, like he was nervous. I tried to make small talk, asked him what was in the bag. Maybe it was camping gear or tools for the car, but he didn't answer. He just gave me this strange look and mumbled something about just personal stuff. That's when the uneasiness started to creep in. His eyes kept darting toward the bag, like he was guarding it. I glanced at the rear view mirror, and my stomach dropped when I noticed a dark stain on the side of the bag. It looked like blood. My mind raced, trying to stay calm, but every instinct was screaming at me to get out of this situation. We drove in silence for a while, tension thick in the air. Greg's fingers never stopped tapping the bag, his eyes never leaving it. I needed a plan fast. Luckily, we were approaching a small gas station. "I need to stop for gas," I said, trying to sound casual. Greg just nodded, but his gaze lingered on me for a little too long. I pulled into the station and parked near the pumps. Greg stayed in the car while I went inside. My heart was racing as I glanced back at the car. I had to know what was in that bag. When I was sure he wasn't looking, I sneaked back to the car and carefully unzipped the bag just enough to peek inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. There were clothes soaked in blood, and on top of them, a large hunting knife. The blade was sharp, and there was dry blood along the edges. I could barely breathe. My hands were shaking, but I knew I had to act fast. I zipped the bag back up quietly, then went inside the station and pretended to buy a drink. As I walked back to the car, I made a split-second decision. I wasn't going to confront him. I wasn't going to ask questions. I was just going to leave him there. "I'll be right back," I lied, pretending to head toward the bathroom. As soon as I was out of sight, I sprinted around the side of the station, jumped into the driver's seat, and hit the gas. The tires screeched as I sped out of the lot, my heart pounding in my chest. In the rearview mirror, I saw Greg run out of the station, waving his arms, shouting something. But I didn't stop. I kept driving, not looking back. I don't know what Greg's deal was, but I'm certain I dodged a bullet that day. Whatever was in that bag, it wasn't just personal stuff. Since that night, I've learned one thing for sure: I'll never pick up a hitchhiker again.